When you picture medieval food, what comes to mind? Giant turkey legs clutched by kings, peasants gnawing on moldy bread, or maybe a table piled high with roasted pigs and dripping gravy like in a Hollywood feast scene. Well, forget all of that. The reality of what medieval people really ate was far stranger, more practical, because the truth is, the medieval diet wasn't just about food, it was about survival, about faith, about class, and even about politics. Every bite a person took in the Middle Ages told a story about who they were, what they believed, and how hard their life really was. And tonight, we're peeling back the curtain on the shocking, gritty truth of the medieval table. Let's start where most people imagine. Bread. Yes, peasants ate bread, but not the fluffy white loaves we think of today. White bread was actually a luxury for the wealthy, made with fine wheat flour that was sifted and milled with care. For the poor, bread was often dark, dense, and heavy. It was made with whatever grain was available: barley, rye, oats, sometimes even beans or peas mixed into the dough. And here's the kicker. When times were especially bad, peasants sometimes stretched their flour with things like acorns, bark, or ground-up weeds. Imagine chewing bread that tasted bitter, gritty, and almost inedible, just to fill your stomach enough to make it through another day. And this bread wasn't always safe. A damp harvest could mean moldy grain, and that mold could trigger something terrifying: ergot poisoning. This cursed bread caused convulsions, hallucinations, and even gangrene that made people's limbs rot away. Whole villages were struck down by it. Some historians even believe outbreaks of ergot poisoning may have fueled witchcraft panics, because the hallucinations were so vivid and terrifying that people thought they were being cursed by the devil. So the bread on a medieval table, it could either keep you alive or kill you slowly. But bread was just the beginning. Let's talk about meat, because this is where fantasy completely collapses. Contrary to what movies show, peasants rarely had meat on their plates. In fact, for many, meat was a once or twice a year luxury, usually reserved for festivals or celebrations. Chickens, pigs, or cows weren't raised primarily for eating. They were too valuable alive. Chickens laid eggs, pigs could be fattened over time, cows gave milk. Killing one meant losing a steady source of food, so for peasants, meat was rare, precious, and usually preserved through salting, smoking, or drying when it was available. Now nobles? That's a different story. The wealthy feasted on meat constantly. Venison from the hunt, swan, peacock, boar, even exotic imports like spices to flavor their dishes. A medieval banquet was a show of wealth as much as it was a meal. Picture a table where a roasted peacock is served still in its feathers, posed dramatically as if it were alive. Imagine fish pies gilded with gold leaf. The nobility used food as theater, proof that they were powerful, rich, and above the daily grind of survival. But here is the twist. Eating too much meat wasn't actually seen as a good thing by the church. Gluttony was a sin, and fasting was a huge part of medieval life. For nearly half the year, Christians were forbidden to eat meat on fast days. That meant fish became essential. Fresh fish was hard to come by unless you lived near a coast or river, so preserved fish, salted herring, dried cod, was the mainstay. And trust me, it wasn't delicious. Imagine chewing leathery, salty slabs of fish day after day, especially in inland villages where it had traveled miles before reaching the table. It's no wonder that peasants joked about dreading Lent when the endless fish diet came rolling back around. Speaking of Lent, let's talk about another surprising medieval favorite: eels. Yes, you heard that right. Eels were one of the most common foods in England during the Middle Ages. They were plentiful, easy to preserve, and filled the gap when meat wasn't allowed. In fact, rents and taxes were sometimes paid in barrels of eels. Try to picture that. Your landlord knocking at your door, and instead of handing him coins, you roll out a barrel full of slippery, wriggling eels. That was currency in medieval Europe. And let's not forget dairy. Milk, cheese, and butter were staples, but not the creamy, pasteurized versions we have today. Milk often went sour quickly, so cheese was the best way to make it last. Soft cheeses, hard cheeses, crumbly cheeses. For peasants, it was a vital protein source. Butter was more common in northern Europe, while in southern regions, olive oil took its place. And of course, everything depended on the season. Fresh food in summer and autumn, salted and preserved food in winter. Every meal was a reminder of the turning of the year. Now here to something that really breaks the myth of the Middle Ages as dirty and tasteless. Medieval cooks loved flavor. Herbs and spices weren't just for the rich. Sure, exotic spices like cinnamon, cloves, and black pepper were luxuries, but peasants had their own flavorings: garlic, onions, leeks, parsley, sage, mustard seeds. A peasant stew simmering in a pot over the fire could be surprisingly fragrant, even if it was just cabbage, beans, and a hint of pork fat. And for the wealthy, spices were more than flavor. They were status. A single pinch of saffron could cost as much as a poor man's wages for a week. Nobles flaunted spices the way we flaunt designer clothes today. A heavily spiced dish wasn't just tasty. It was proof that you had the wealth and connections to import treasures from across the world. But while we're painting this picture of the medieval table, let's pause and remember something important. The vast majority of people weren't feasting. They weren't enjoying variety. For peasants, the diet was monotonous, repetitive, and driven by what was cheap and available. Pottage, a kind of thick stew made from grains, beans, and vegetables, was the backbone of daily eating. Day after day, peasants ate pottage with a hunk of bread. Sometimes, if they were lucky, a bit of meat or cheese went into the pot, but often it was just plants, boiled until soft, served in wooden bowls. And this monotony wasn't just boring. It was dangerous. Malnutrition was common. A bad harvest could mean starvation. Diseases linked to poor diets like scurvy or rickets weren't understood but were part of everyday reality. So when we ask, what did medieval people really eat? The honest answer is, whatever they could, whenever they could, and often not enough. But before you think it was all bleak, remember this. Food was also joy, celebration, and community. The yearly harvest festival meant bread and beer flowed freely. Christmas was a time for feasting. Weddings and church holidays brought out rare luxuries even for peasants. These occasions were precious not just because of the food, but because they broke the monotony of survival. Imagine the excitement of tasting honey, roasted meat, or spiced cakes once or twice a year. Flavors so rare that they lingered in memory for months afterward. So if you really want to understand medieval food, you have to imagine two extremes: the noble banquet, dripping with wealth and spectacle, and the peasant pot of pottage bubbling quietly over the fire. Somewhere between those two realities, people survived, endured, and occasionally celebrated. And the story of what they ate reveals more about the Middle Ages than any battle or castle wall ever could. Because the truth is, food wasn't just food. It was survival. It was power. It was faith. And it was the difference between life and death. And as we keep digging deeper, you'll see that what they ate and what they didn't eat shaped the medieval world in ways you'd never expect. If bread, fish, and pottage were the foundation of medieval diets, then drinks were the glue that held the entire system together. And no, it wasn't water. Believe it or not, most medieval people avoided drinking water whenever they could. Why? Because water was dangerous. Streams and wells could easily be contaminated with human waste, animal runoff, or even corpses upstream. One sip could bring sickness or death. So instead, people drank ale, not the craft beers you might be imagining, but a weak, low-alcohol brew known as small ale. It was cheap, nutritious, and, most importantly, safe. Even children drank it daily. Brewing was usually done at home, especially by women, and in some villages, ale was so essential that local economies relied on it. Taxes were collected on it. Wages were sometimes paid in it, and peasants practically lived on it. Think about that for a second. In the Middle Ages, ale wasn't a luxury. It was water's replacement. People literally survived on beer. Of course, the nobility had access to better drinks. Imported wines from France or Spain were prized, especially sweet varieties. Spiced wine, known as hippocras, was a favorite at feasts, often dyed with saffron to show off its exotic pedigree. Meanwhile, monasteries became famous for their brewing and winemaking skills, turning alcohol into both an economic engine and a sacred product. And let's not forget mead, honey wine, which was considered almost magical, associated with feasting, weddings, and even fertility rituals. But now let us step back and get into something much more surprising. Medieval people ate things that would make most of us today gag. One striking example? Offal. Every part of an animal was used. Organs, intestines, stomach lining, brains, blood. Nothing was wasted. Blood pudding, tripe stew, liver pies. These weren't exotic delicacies. They were survival food. If you were lucky enough to slaughter a pig, you didn't dare throw away the intestines. You cleaned them, stuffed them, and turned them into sausages. Waste meant hunger. Waste meant death. And some of these foods had a cultural value beyond survival. Take blood, for instance. In a world where iron deficiency was rampant, consuming blood-rich dishes provided a vital source of nutrients. The wealthy may have dined on roasted venison and spiced fish, but the poor learned to embrace foods that were harsh, bitter, or even disgusting to modern taste buds, because they had no choice. Now here's a truly bizarre twist. Did you know some medieval people ate what they called starvation bread? When harvests failed and grain ran out, peasants were forced to grind whatever they could find into flour, bark from trees, ground-up acorns, or even dried grass mixed with dust. These loaves were heavy, coarse, and nearly indigestible. Eating them often caused more harm than good, tearing at the stomach and providing little real nourishment. But imagine being a mother watching your children cry from hunger. Wouldn't you bake anything, no matter how terrible, just to quiet their pain? That was the brutal reality. Meanwhile, in towns and cities, markets offered a wider variety of foods, but not without danger. Picture a medieval marketplace. Stalls piled high with bread, fish, and meat. But there's no refrigeration, no plastic wrap, no food safety standards, flies buzzing around raw meat left out in the sun, fish reeking after days without ice, milk curdled before it even reached the buyer. People bought what they could afford, often knowing it was spoiled, because what choice did they have? And if they got sick? Illness was just another part of life, and yet food was more than fuel. It was tied deeply to faith and the rhythms of the church. Fasting wasn't just about avoiding meat. During Lent and other holy days, dairy and eggs were also banned. That meant peasants turned to creative substitutes. Almond milk, for example, was surprisingly popular. Nobles had the wealth to import almonds from Spain or Italy, and cooks ground them into a milk substitute for rich sauces. Even the poor sometimes tried to mimic these fasting dishes, though theirs were much simpler. Religion didn't just shape belief. It shaped what people ate and when. But what about sweets? Were there medieval desserts? Absolutely. Though they looked nothing like the cakes and cookies we think of today. Honey was the main sweetener for peasants. They might drizzle it on bread or use it to flavor porridge. The wealthy, on the other hand, had access to sugar, imported at enormous expense from the Middle East. And here's the fun part. Sugar wasn't treated like a pantry staple. It was considered a medicine. Apothecaries sold sugar lumps as cures for illness. Only later did sugar creep into cooking, where it transformed into candied fruits, sugared almonds, and elaborate pastries served at banquets. Speaking of banquets, let us pause and look at how different the dining experience was between the rich and the poor. Imagine the great hall of a castle during a feast, tables lined with roasted animals, gilded dishes, steaming pies, and colored jellies. Entertainment, music, jugglers, and dancers. Eating wasn't just about food. It was performance, a way for lords and kings to show off their wealth and power. In contrast, peasants sat in small wooden homes, eating from shared bowls, sometimes with only a wooden spoon or their bare hands. A feast for them might mean a slightly thicker stew or bread with a scrap of cheese. Two worlds separated by class, living side by side, yet experiencing food in completely different universes. And yet both rich and poor shared one common thread: food insecurity. Even the nobility could suffer if wars cut off trade routes or bad weather destroyed crops. The poor starved first, but famine could humble anyone. And famine wasn't rare. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, triggered by relentless rain and failed harvests, killed millions across Europe. People ate their seed grain, slaughtered their work animals, and in some cases turned to shocking extremes. Chroniclers even recorded stories of cannibalism. That's how fragile the medieval food system was. One bad season could bring entire regions to their knees. Still, amid all this harshness, food could also be joy. Fairs and festivals featured roasted nuts, honey cakes, and spiced wine. Peasants saved up for a special treat at Christmas. Maybe a little meat, maybe some ale brewed stronger than usual. Monks experimented with recipes, refining brewing techniques and developing cheeses that we still eat today. Food wasn't just survival. It was culture. It was identity. And here's the part that surprises most people. Medieval diets, while brutal, were often healthier than what came centuries later. Why? Because everything was natural. No processed sugar on a massive scale, no refined flour for the poor, no chemical preservatives. Vegetables, grains, beans, fish, and occasional meat formed the bulk of daily diets. Malnutrition was common, but obesity was almost non-existent. In fact, some historians argue that many peasants ate more fiber and fewer empty calories than the average modern person. So while their meals might sound bleak, in some ways, They were cleaner and less artificial than ours. But don't romanticize it. Eating in the Middle Ages wasn't about choice or lifestyle. It was about scraping by. Every bite depended on the weather, on harvests, on disease, on war. Food was power, and those who controlled it held life and death in their hands. Lords controlled the grain mills, the fishing rights, the hunting forests. Peasants lived constantly on the edge. One failed harvest away from ruin. Nobles showed off their wealth through extravagant meals, while the poor prayed their pottage would stretch one more night. And that's what makes medieval food so fascinating. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't disgusting across the board either. It was complicated, strange, dangerous, and sometimes unexpectedly delicious. But above all, it was a mirror of medieval life itself, brutal, fragile, yet still infused with moments of celebration and joy. As we go deeper, we'll uncover even more shocking details. The bizarre superstitions tied to food, the strange medical beliefs about diet, and the wild extremes between famine and feast. Because if you think you know what medieval people really ate, trust me, the surprises have only just begun. By now, you've probably realized that medieval diets weren't just about what people could physically eat. They were also deeply shaped by beliefs, traditions, and what passed for science at the time. And when I say science, I mean something that will sound bizarre to us today. Medieval people believed that food wasn't just fuel. It affected your personality, your mood, even your morality. This all came from the ancient theory of the four humors, a medical system inherited from the Greeks and Romans. According to this belief, the human body was governed by four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Balance between these humors meant health, imbalance meant sickness. And food? Food was thought to directly influence this balance. So if someone had too much phlegm, doctors recommended hot and dry foods, like roasted meats or spices, to balance it out. If someone was melancholic from too much black bile, they might prescribe sweet or moist foods like fruits. Yes, even in the Middle Ages, people were being told what to eat to fix their mood swings, just with very questionable science. This belief system shaped diets across Europe. Certain foods were seen as warming or cooling, and physicians wrote entire diet guides on what a person of each body type should eat. Imagine being told that garlic wasn't just a flavoring but a medicine that could realign your humors, or that cucumbers were dangerous because they made you too cold and moist. In a way, medieval diets weren't just about survival. They were a constant negotiation between what you could afford, what your religion allowed, and what medieval experts told you was good for your body. And this leads us to something both fascinating and ridiculous. The rich sometimes made their food choices not because of taste or hunger, but because of how it fit into their medical theory. A lord might refuse certain fruits because they were too cooling, or insist on heavily spiced meats because they were warming and therefore good for vitality. In other words, food was medicine, whether it worked or not. But here's where things get really strange. Medieval people also believed food could carry spiritual danger. Take beans, for example. Monks were often warned against eating too many beans because they were said to cause flatulence, which could distract from prayer and purity. Some even believed beans could stir up lustful thoughts. Yes, beans. In some regions, garlic and onions carried a reputation for being both medicine and a symbol of peasant vulgarity. What you ate said something about who you were. That's a crucial point. In the Middle Ages, food wasn't just about nutrition, it was social. It defined class. Bread is the best example of this. Remember how I mentioned earlier that everyone ate bread? Well, the type of bread you ate marked your place in society. Nobles ate fine white bread made from carefully sifted wheat flour. Middle classes ate a coarser, darker loaf. The poor often had to make do with bread mixed with rye, oats, or even whatever filler they could find. In some manners, the lord's household literally ate a different loaf than the peasants working his land. Bread wasn't just food, it was a class system baked into every bite. And then there were the extreme displays of wealth. Have you ever heard of a subtlety? These were elaborate dishes served at feasts, designed not to be eaten, but to amaze. Imagine a roasted peacock, redressed in its own feathers, brought to the table in full display, or pies that, when cut open, released live birds that flew out. Yes, that actually happened. Food wasn't just nourishment, it was entertainment, propaganda, and a way to show power. If you could afford spices like cinnamon, cloves, or pepper, imported from halfway across the world, you made sure everyone saw you use them, because spices weren't just for flavor. They were status. But let's step away from the halls of kings and nobles for a moment, and go back to the everyday lives of peasants. Their relationship with food was far more practical. but also filled with traditions and rituals. Meals were usually communal, with families and sometimes neighbors eating from shared bowls or pots. Table manners, as we think of them today, didn't really exist. Forks were rare. People used knives, spoons, or just their hands. Bread often doubled as a plate. Large stale chunks called trenchers were used to hold food, and when the meal was done, those bread trenchers were either eaten or given to the poor. Nothing went to waste. And speaking of waste, medieval kitchens were masters of avoiding it. Leftover bread could be turned into puddings, soups, or thickeners for sauces. Bones were boiled into broths. Cheese that was going off could be baked into pies. Even stale ale was used in cooking. It was a system built on necessity, but also one that today we might call sustainable. They didn't have the luxury of throwing food out, and in that sense they lived closer to the earth than most of us do now. Now, let us talk about one of the strangest quirks of medieval diets: the way they mixed sweet and savory. Today, we're used to desserts coming at the end of a meal, but in the Middle Ages, sugar, honey, and spices were often used directly in meat dishes. Imagine eating chicken stewed with sugar, cinnamon, and almonds, or beef cooked with raisins and prunes. To medieval palates, this was luxurious and exciting. The clear divide between main course and dessert simply didn't exist. Sweet and savory mingled constantly, and it wasn't just flavor. Many of these combinations were tied back to the humor theory. Sugar was considered warming, so adding it to meat wasn't just delicious, it was healthy. Again, this shows how medieval diets can't really be understood without seeing how medicine, class, and culture overlapped. But food wasn't just about health or class. It was about survival in a dangerous world. Picture this: a long journey across medieval Europe. What do you pack to eat? You can't just stop at a gas station or grab fast food. Travelers carried hard, durable foods: dried fish, tough cheese, hard bread, things that wouldn't spoil quickly. Monks and pilgrims often lived off donated food or carried dried peas and beans in small sacks. And for those who could afford it, spices and salt were lifesavers, not just for flavor but for preserving food on the road. This brings us to salt. Salt was absolutely essential in the medieval diet. Not only was it one of the few ways to preserve meat and fish, but it was so valuable it was sometimes used as currency. Wars were fought over access to salt mines. Cities grew wealthy by controlling salt routes. A person's ability to survive the winter often depended on whether they had enough salt to preserve their meat or fish. Without it, starvation loomed. But perhaps one of the most fascinating aspects of medieval food culture was the idea of feast versus famine. Ordinary life for peasants was a grind of repetitive, simple meals. But when a holiday came, food became something else entirely. Christmas, Easter, harvest festivals. These were times when communities pooled resources, slaughtered animals, and ate heartily, often for days on end. Imagine living most of your life on thin porridge and then suddenly being invited to a feast with roast pork, cheese, and strong ale. It wasn't just about eating, it was about belonging, about hope, about marking survival in a world where tomorrow wasn't guaranteed. And on the other side of that joy was famine, an ever-present threat. Remember, this was an agricultural world. One bad harvest meant hunger. Two bad harvests meant death. Famine reshaped diets in terrifying ways, forcing people to eat whatever they could find, from roots and weeds to leather and bark. Chroniclers even whispered about cannibalism in the worst years. It is a haunting reminder that medieval food wasn't just quaint dishes and odd recipes. It was life and death, played out year after year. So when we look at medieval diets, we have to hold both extremes in our minds: the joy of communal feasting and the despair of famine, the laughter of peasants drinking ale together, and the silence of a village facing starvation. It was a world where food was never taken for granted. And here is where things come full circle, because while medieval food may seem strange to us, it actually shaped the world we live in today. Many of the recipes, preservation methods, and even food taboos of the Middle Ages laid the foundation for modern cuisines. Without their obsession with spices, would global trade have exploded the way it did? Without their techniques for brewing and cheesemaking, would we still enjoy those foods today? The medieval table may be centuries behind us, but its influence still lingers in every loaf of bread, every glass of ale, every feast we celebrate. But we're not done yet, because in the final part of this journey, we'll go deeper into the weirdest, wildest, and most shocking food practices of the Middle Ages. From bizarre remedies made with animal parts to the strange rituals of medieval banquets. And trust me, you'll never look at dinner the same way again. By now you've seen how food in the Middle Ages wasn't just a matter of taste. It was survival, class, medicine, and ritual all rolled into one. But let us finish this story by diving into the strangest and most jaw-dropping details of medieval eating habits. Because honestly, this is where things get weird. Let us start with one of the most bizarre culinary traditions: the use of animal parts for both food and medicine. In a world without modern pharmacies, people looked to what they had on hand. And that usually meant livestock. Cow stomachs were not only eaten as tripe but also used in folk remedies. Pig fat was smeared on wounds. Animal blood wasn't just cooked into sausages, it was sometimes drunk fresh, believed to restore strength or cure illness. Yes, that actually happened. And if you're wondering, wasn't that dangerous? Oh, absolutely. Drinking raw blood was a quick ticket to infections, but when survival is uncertain and your entire culture teaches you that the right animal part can heal, you take risks. This wasn't seen as disgusting. It was seen as practical, even sacred. Then there's the shocking world of food preservation. We've already talked about salt, but what about meat and fish? People sometimes used methods that, to us, sound almost horrifying. Fish could be dried so hard that it had to be beaten with a hammer before it was edible. Meat was sometimes smoked until it was tough as leather. There are even records of meat being soaked in soured ale or vinegar for days to extend its life, which meant when you finally ate it, you were basically gnawing on something halfway to rotten. Imagine how that tasted. And yet this was the difference between life and death during winter. Speaking of taste, we should clear up one of the biggest myths about medieval food: the idea that spices were used to cover up the flavor of spoiled meat. Historians now know that wasn't really true. Spices were far too expensive to waste on bad food. In fact, if you had access to spices like pepper, cinnamon, or saffron, you were wealthy enough to afford fresh meat anyway. But spoiled food still got eaten, no question. Ordinary people couldn't afford to throw it out, and if you were a peasant, you learned to tolerate flavors that today we would find absolutely revolting. But not all strangeness came from necessity. Some of it was deliberate, even artistic. Let's talk medieval banquets, because if there's one place where food got truly outrageous, it was at the feasting tables of kings and nobles. These feasts were about more than eating. They were theater. Imagine walking into a great hall lit by torches, music playing, dogs under the table waiting for scraps, and the centerpiece arriving: a roast swan, served with its feathers carefully stitched back on to make it look alive. Guests gasped, clapped, and dug in. This wasn't just dinner, it was a statement. Other times, food was turned into literal illusions. A dish called helmeted cock involved roasting a chicken, then placing it inside a pig's stomach so it looked like some kind of hybrid animal. Or take the famous cockentrice, a dish created by sewing together the front half of a pig and the back half of a goose, roasted as if it were a single beast. Why? To amaze the guests, to prove the cook's skill, and most importantly, to remind everyone of the Lord's wealth and power. Food was theater, spectacle, even propaganda. But while the nobles were feasting on bizarre hybrids and sipping spiced wine, peasants had their own strange traditions. One of the more curious ones involved communal drinking vessels. Ale or cider was often served in a single large mug or bowl, passed around the table. Everyone drank from it in turn, regardless of hygiene. In some regions, a shared spoon was passed along with the stew. Today we'd be horrified by the germs. Back then it was just part of community life. Eating together literally meant sharing everything. And yet, food wasn't always just food. It carried layers of meaning, even superstition. Take eggs, for example. They weren't only a staple, they were surrounded by belief. Some thought eating too many eggs could make you lustful. Others believed eggshells, if not properly destroyed, could be used by witches as tiny boats to cast curses. That might sound absurd, but people took it seriously. The line between food and magic was paper thin. Garlic and onions were similar. For peasants, they were everyday essentials. For the wealthy, they carried a whiff of vulgarity. Too strong, too rustic. But even so, garlic was valued as a protector against illness, especially the plague. Some people wore cloves of garlic around their necks, believing it kept death away. The smell of your food could mark you as poor, but it could also be your shield in a world where disease lurked everywhere. Now, we can't finish this story without talking about the strangest intersection of food, religion, and fear: fasting. The medieval church controlled not just what people believed, but also what they ate. There were strict rules about fasting days, and in some years almost half the calendar was technically a fast. On those days, meat was forbidden. Fish, however, was allowed, leading to some very creative definitions of fish. Beavers, for example, were sometimes classified as fish because they had tails and lived in water. Even barnacle geese, strange birds thought to grow from driftwood, were declared fair game during fasting. In other words, when the rules of religion clashed with the reality of diet, people bent the rules in very odd ways. But the strictness of fasting also meant entire communities had to shift their diets constantly, which was exhausting. Imagine being a peasant barely scraping by on bread and peas only to be told that your occasional bit of bacon was forbidden for weeks on end. Religion shaped not only your soul but your stomach. And speaking of stomachs, let's not forget the darker side of medieval food: famine. Earlier we touched on it, but here's the brutal truth. Famine warped diets into something barely recognizable. People boiled weeds, bark, even shoe leather to survive. Chroniclers wrote of parents eating the flesh of their dead children. Whether as desperate rumor or grim reality, we can't be sure. Hunger was a monster that haunted the medieval world, and every strange food practice, every pie stuffed with dried peas, every desperate fasting workaround, was part of a society constantly battling starvation. And yet, through all of this, medieval people created food cultures that still echo today. Our bread, our cheese, our beers and wines, they all trace their roots back to those dark kitchens and smoky hearths. Even the way we feast on holidays, gathering with family to share special dishes, is a tradition they would recognize instantly. But maybe the most shocking truth is this: medieval food wasn't nearly as bland or boring as we've been led to believe. It was vibrant, spiced, experimental, and deeply tied to the rhythms of life. For every tale of stale bread and weak ale, there's another of rich sauces, sweet salty stews, and feasts that dazzled the senses. So the next time you sit down for a meal, take a moment to imagine the medieval table. Imagine the trenchers of bread, the smell of wood smoke, the laughter of a community sharing a single bowl of stew. Imagine the nobleman sprinkling saffron to show his wealth, or the peasant carefully preserving fish to survive the winter. Food wasn't just food. It was identity. It was survival. It was the heartbeat of a world both strange and familiar. And perhaps that's the real lesson here. When we strip away the myths and really look at what medieval people ate, we see ourselves. Our same desire for comfort, for community, for flavor, for meaning. Their diets may seem alien, but their hunger, both for food and for life, is something we still share.